As a quick follow-up to my guide to genetic archives, here's a guide on the first 3 mini-bosses of Datascape. After genetic archives, many guilds including my own will experience the infamous roster boss. Since Mystic started with one GA group, we're faced with the need to double our raid roster for Datascape. We are getting close, but we're still a few people short of the 40 needed to start progressing on system daemons. So as always, Mystic is recruiting skilled players of all classes on Entity. For those that are in the same position as us, you can start farming trash and or the first 3 mini-bosses of Datascape with the people you have attuned. The first 2 mini-bosses can be done with just 20, but I would recommend having 25 to 30 people for the 3rd mini-boss. Each mini-boss drops 2 pieces of legendaries from a large loot table that pretty much includes everything except weapons. I will not be going over the trash in this video as they will be easy for guilds that have clear genetic archives. The 3 mini-bosses are optimized memory probes TX-67, SD-1, and P2-Z in that order of difficulty. These mini-bosses are largely scripted, so once you get the pattern down for each boss they can be quite easy. First is TX-67. It requires 1 to 2 tanks and 2 to 4 healers. The boss has no interruptible spells and auto attacks in a frontal line telegraph. I recommend having everyone in the raid bring their CC break ability for this fight. To start the fight, have the tank pull from the opposite side of where the raid is standing so the probe's first auto attack doesn't one-shot the raid. 3 seconds after the probe is engaged, it will cast induced latency on the location of a random raid member. A large star-shaped telegraph, okay it's not really a star, but you get the point, that explodes after 2.5 seconds, dealing a moderate amount of damage and putting a snaring dot on those caught inside. The dot ticks for around 4,000 damage and can be dispelled. The boss will cast induced latency every 10 seconds unless it is overwritten by its second ability, Demagnetize. 10 seconds after the first induced latency is casted, the boss will put data anchors on the entire raid, tethering the players and begin casting Demagnetize, a series of large circular telegraphs that completes after 6 seconds, killing those caught inside. Each anchor has 79k HP and can either be killed by the raid or CC broken out of. The raid will want to stack up tightly for the anchors so they can be cleaved down. Simply kill the anchors and dodge out of the telegraphs to avoid dying to Demagnetize. Immediately after Demagnetize, the boss will cast Induced Latency. Demagnetize has a 30-second cooldown, so after his first cast the boss will now cast his abilities in a pattern, with 3 Induced Latency, including the one immediately after Demagnetize before every Demagnetize cast. This pattern will continue until the boss hits 75%, where it once again tethers the entire raid and begins casting Firewall Defense Beam, a wide line telegraph in front of the boss that finishes casting after 3 seconds and starts spinning in a random direction for approximately 220 degrees. I recommend the entire raid to CC break out of the Defense Beam's data anchors to dodge the mechanic. Think of the Defense Beam as a reset to the fight, where the boss will now cast his abilities in the same order as if you just engaged it, beginning with the Induced Latency immediately after Defense Beam. 10 seconds after that induced latency comes Demagnetize, triggering its 30-second cooldown. The boss will now enter the 3 induced latency 1 demagnetized pattern until 50%, where it casts its second Firewall Defense Beam. The pattern will once again reset after the second Defense Beam and continue until 25%. After the 3rd and last Defense Beam, follow the cast pattern and finish the boss off. The second memory probe is ED-1. This fight requires 1 to 2 tanks and 2 to 4 healers. Same as TX-67, it has no interruptible spells and auto attacks in their frontal line telegraph. Likewise, I recommend having everyone in the raid bring their CC break abilities for this fight. Similar to TX-67, this boss casts its spell in a pattern, starting with induced latency 3 seconds after the boss is engaged. 10 seconds after the first induced latency is casted, the boss will cast Orbital Disintegration. Orbital Disintegration casts a red circular telegraph on a random person in the raid that will follow that person for the duration of the cast. At the end of its 5-second cast, it will deal a large amount of damage distributed evenly to those inside the telegraph. Therefore, you'll want to stack on top of the telegraph to share the damage. Note that the damage can be survived by 2 tanks if it's casted on the tanks. The damage is survivable as long as you have more than 14-ish people with a damage reduction cooldown. If you drop below this number, simply sacrifice the person off to the side. After the first Orbital Disintegration, the boss enters a 3 induced latency 1 Orbital Disintegration pattern until it hits 75%. At 75%, the boss will cast Kinetic Disruption on the entire raid, disorienting and greatly increasing everyone's movement speed. Followed immediately is the Obliteration Beam, a 3-second cast spell that draws a wide line telegraph in front and behind the boss. After the cast, the beam will spin in a random direction for approximately 220 degrees. I recommend having the entire raid use their CC break abilities to clear the disorient and dodge the beam. The beam likewise resets the boss's cast pattern, beginning with induced latency immediately after the beam fades. 10 seconds after that induced latency, it is back to Orbital Disintegration, followed by the 3 induced latency and 1 Orbital Disintegration pattern until it hits 50%. At 50%, the boss will once again disorient the raid and cast Obliteration Beam. However, unlike the Orbital Disintegrations in the first 50% of the fight, TX-67 will now cast Kinetic Disruption on the raid at the beginning of every Orbital Disintegration. Therefore, it is important for the raid to stack and remain stationary for Orbital Disintegration after the first induced latency and every 3 induced latencies thereafter, to avoid running all over the place disoriented. The fight repeats itself until the boss is dead. The last memory probe is P2-Z. This fight requires 1 tank and 3 to 5 healers. P2-Z is much harder than the previous 2 probes and is the mini-boss that gets easier with more people. Same as the previous 2 mini-bosses, it has no interruptible spells and auto-attacks in a frontal line telegraph. The raid will want to bring as many interrupts as possible for this fight. CC break abilities can be helpful, but are not required. Aside from the same induced latency mechanic casted 3 seconds after engagement, P2-Z will summon a fragmented memory on a random player of the raid immediately after it is engaged. Fragmented memories look like a smaller version of the mini-boss and spawns after a 1-second small circular telegraph is completed. At completion, the telegraph will deal a small amount of damage, stun those inside, and spawn a fragmented memory. Fragmented memories spawn every 3 seconds and have 5 interrupt armors. They attack in line telegraphs in random directions that deal a small amount of damage to those caught inside. To kill the fragmented memories, they must be interrupted. Note that they do not regenerate interrupt armors. About 7 seconds after the second induced latency, note that this is different from the previous 2 bosses, P2-Z will now cast Fragmented Memory Purge, a 3-second cast spell that spawns 10 fragmented memories at the end of the cast and puts down an induced latency. These 10 fragmented memories are spawned the same way as the previous memories, with small red circular telegraphs indicating their spawn spots. If you get stunned by a fragmented memory inside the induced latency, you will likely die from the subsequent auto attacks from the 10 fragmented memories. Unlike the magnetize and orbital disintegration, fragmented memory purge is on a 40-second cooldown, meaning there will be 4 induced latencies in between each purge, including the one immediately after the purge cast. The raid can easily be overwhelmed by fragmented memories if they are not kept under control, so this is why you need as many interrupts as possible. You need to be able to consistently interrupt fragmented memories throughout the fight while still having enough interrupts to clear the 10 that spawn from the purge. It is therefore important to have the 10 fragmented memories spawn close enough to allow interrupt abilities to hit multiple ones. Since fragmented memories spawn on people, my guild collapses during the purge cast and dodges out of the spawn telegraphs and induced latency after the cast. At 75%, P2-Z will cast Obliteration Beam. However, unlike the 2-prong beam from the last boss, it is a 3-prong beam that rotates in a random direction for approximately 220 degrees after the cast. Since fragmented memories do not spawn during the beam, it is a good time for the raid to clean up any stragglers around the room. However, make sure to save enough interrupts for the next purge. After the beam comes an immediate induced latency. The first fragmented memory purge will come 9 seconds later and the boss will then repeat the 4 induced latency 1 fragmented memory purge pattern until the next obliteration beam at 50%. The fight then repeats itself until the boss is dead. Please like and subscribe if you find this video helpful. Thank you and I'll see you next time.